Welcome back, everyone. I don't know if this slide appeared when Rich was talking, but as I saw the screen, it's very interesting. So if you just want to take a look, Rich, I'm co-opting your slides for just a second here as we think about the goal of this conference. I just thought that was an interesting one. But I invite our workshop 4 panelists to come up and join us. Thank you, Margaret. And we will move on to the next workshop. Our moderator will be Mary Thompson, former CNBC reporter and currently at G100, and a College of St. Benedict trustee. So welcome, Mary, and I invite you to introduce the panelists. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you, Mary. I can just sit right here. Right? Well, welcome, everyone, to the 4th and final workshop. Sorry. I'll stand up. Just one? There we go. That makes it better. We'll pass it down the line. Welcome to the 4th and final workshop of Liberal Arts Illuminated 2018. I'm delighted to be here and participate in what has been a very successful conference, so far from what I've heard from you. So great to be here, and great to be here with the panelists as well. This workshop is called Leading Towards a New Public Narrative about the Liberal Arts Education. And to help us with, to explore this issue, we have Mary Brainerd, who is the recently retired CEO of Health Partners here in Minnesota, which is basically the largest consumer-governed nonprofit healthcare company in the country. And under her leadership over 15 years, this company experienced record growth. She was in charge of 21,000 employees and is a strong proponent of the liberal arts education, the liberal arts in general. Importantly, she also, in her new role as a retiree, and a very busy one at that, as many of you know if you've retired and had all sorts of opportunities present themselves, she's also the founding partner of the Itasca Project, which is a group of government, business, and civic leaders who focus on addressing some of the issues that affect long-term economic growth, including education, jobs, and economic disparity. So Mary, welcome, and thank you for joining us today. And then sitting to Mary's left is Dr. Randy Bass of Georgetown University. He is an associate professor of English at Georgetown, and also he is the executive director for the school's Center for New Design in Learning and Scholarship. And over 22 years, he has looked very closely at the intersection of education and learning models and new technology in media, which he will be speaking about, and I think is something very important, which was touched on in the prior presentation by Rich, talking about AI and machine learning, and Randy is going to be talking more about that. So before we begin the question and answer part of this presentation, I just want to focus on the desired learning outcomes of this workshop, just to highlight them again, to understand the impact the current narrative has had on higher education in the public sphere, identify why the current narrative poses challenges for higher education, employers, and the future of the nation, articulate a new narrative that reflects current research and practice, and then identify strategies and steps to reframe the existing narrative in your community. So Mary, I'm going to start with you, because when I was first approached to do this, I thought this problem, I think, with the narrative of higher education, specifically liberal arts, it's not something that has happened over the last 10 years or the last 20 years. I think back to, I had an uncle who went to MIT, and he was born in 1904. And he went to MIT because his grandfather would only pay for him to go to MIT. He would not pay for him to go to Harvard because he would get a job when he left MIT. And my uncle went to MIT for 3 years and then dropped out and became a writer. And then in 1985, when I graduated with a degree in English, I had a bunch of accounting major friends who told me, you're never going to make money. And indeed, I didn't make as much money as they did when they graduated. And fast forward 5 years, and that narrative has changed. And again, it's happening now as well with, higher education, liberal arts coming under criticism for the cost, and then what is the perceived value once you complete that education. So from your perspective, as an employer, as someone who has hired liberal arts graduates over the years, what is it in the public sphere that we are getting wrong in talking about the benefits of a liberal arts education?
Yeah, so as you note, I think one of the big challenges that we have in addressing that question is that it isn't a new question, it's an old question. It becomes an even bigger question not only when the cost of education is high, but when the economy is poor. And we're just coming out of that cycle. And so, as many of you know, you can clearly see a change in the education that students pursue when the economy is lousy, because they go automatically to those degree programs that lead to jobs. So I think part of the narrative that needs to change, I know you were talking about whether the term liberal arts needs to change. The narrative that I think needs to change is the term soft skills, because that's what employers tend to call the abilities and capabilities that people have when they graduate with a liberal arts education. And I just take a contrary point of view. I think that the abilities that people have when they finish a liberal arts degree are actually the most essential skills for being successful in a work environment. And you all are educators and experts, so you know this field, this area far better than I. But I was really struck by the aims that Princeton has for its students. There are 3. That students read critically, write cogently, and think broadly. And if there's ever a prescription for the kind of workforce that I know I was interested in building in my organization, it's people who have those skills and capabilities. And far more, in healthcare, you really need to understand people. And being able to understand difference, age difference, cultural difference, racial differences, religious differences, and not only understand them, but be empathetic to the differences is a huge part of, I think, creating a successful healthcare workforce. So I would add that. And those, to me, figuring out how to talk about those capabilities in a new way is a really important part of changing the narrative about liberal arts.
Randy, I want to turn to you and ask you, what is critical to dismantling this negative narrative that surrounded the liberal arts?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Mary. So I am going to actually answer that question in an indirect way. And I do have a few slides, so I hope, apparently I'm continuing the pattern of like men having slides and whatever, but I wanted to say a couple things if I can, just to sort of open that up, and I'm sorry if it's a little bit presentational. I'll try to just do it for a few minutes here. Because I think that we can't really dismantle a narrative that took a long time to build and that we didn't actually mantle. And so, so in part, I think the negative narrative is very much about just the disconnect between who we think we are and what we think we're doing and what it is that the world needs us to be. So I think that the most important way to address the negative narrative is for us to actually write a narrative about our own future, which I think higher education doesn't have a narrative about its own future. I think largely we let Silicon Valley write whatever narrative there is about the future, and I think Rich would probably agree with that. For many years at Georgetown, I've been teaching a course to undergraduates called The University as a Design Problem. Taught it with a wonderful architect named Ann Pendleton Julian. And we'd have undergraduates trying to design the University of the Year 2030 or 2033 or whatnot, which I highly recommend for all of your schools. Students are filled with wonderful, unworkable, imaginative, inspirational ideas. And it's changed my life. So, but one of the things we did when we asked them to think about the future was to tell them they're not designing for content, they're designing for context. And to ask what will the conditions of knowledge, work, and learning look like in 15 years, and what kind of student would we want to produce for that world. We know a lot about that world. We don't know everything about it. We know that computers are going to do a lot of the work that humans do, and there's only going to be a little bit of work, or a narrower gauge of work left to humans. Some of the work done by Levy and Murnane. And that's what's going to be left to humans. Working on unstructured problems, working with new information, carrying out non-routine manual tasks, which I'm sure are all the kinds of things that employers are most looking for, is people who have that kind of agility. And the question is, should we be teaching students to do anything except those things? That's what's going to be left to humans. And a lot of work is also being done on AI. I'll, of course, leave these slides. I'm going to come back to some of these points when I'm me again in the next hour. But there's an interesting TED Talk by a guy named Dan Susskind who talks about the history of technological replacement of humans, which, of course, goes back as far as the first stick that proved better than a fingernail. But that there's a pattern where machines are superior to things humans can do. Certain people lose their jobs, or humans get substituted by machines in certain work. But then humans have mostly figured out what the human-machine complementarity is, right? So that we've ended up creating much greater productivity out of that substitution. And one example that many people give is that 2% of our population now grows enough food for everybody instead of 40% 100 years ago, because of human-machine complementarity. I think a big question about rewriting the narrative is to ask, what's higher education's version of human-machine complementarity? What's that going to look like? What's our version of massive productivity or democratization or accessibility? So if I can just take another 2 minutes to sort of put this on a map, and I'll come back to this. Rich said, it's always good to be in the right quadrant. I'm all about the right quadrant, the upper right quadrant. I think this whole conference has been about the upper right quadrant, where inclusiveness and integration comes together. I'll work this in the next hour more slowly. But the way that I get here is by posing, there are two ways of thinking about education: disintegrative versus integrative, whether you think education is more than the sum of its parts. Clearly everybody in this room does. And whether you're devoted to inclusive or exclusive excellence. Higher education, nobody uses the term exclusive excellence, right? Because that's what college was for 200 years in the United States. If you Google inclusive excellence, you'll get 350,000 hits to AAC and U. And if you Google exclusive excellence, you'll find luxury resorts in Mexico. But I think it's interesting to think about this as a landscape map of higher education. So you can put a lot of disruptors out in the inclusive end, but toward the disintegrative, like they're just teaching very targeted skills. Put someone like Minerva way down in the exclusive and integrative, claim they're the first elite university in 100 years. Most liberal arts colleges in this room, I think, are down around here. Open access public here, but lots of pressures pulling liberal arts colleges into the inclusive space. Lots of innovations pulling the open access publics into the integrative space. Lots of things pulling them in the other direction, like declining public funding and stupid politicians. But I think that's the space that we've been working in. And the only reason I say this, and I just want to end here, is that there's been a lot of talk about the Z-axis around quality and what it means to sort of live in that space and to develop our institutions in that space. And I think that's one of the key questions for this narrative and the long-term narrative of higher education is, what is that vector in this space? What is our future? Who do we think we will be if we actually maximize our potential of those two values of being inclusive and integrative? You know, who are we trying to create? Great workers, agile workers, agents of positive change, nation of innovators, compassionate people, people who can address our greatest existential threats. So the last slide, and then I'll stop in my spontaneous response to your question. I had no idea you were going to ask me that. Completely blindsided. And I think this encompasses the college-employer relationship and much more, which is that we're not looking at ourselves this way. We've always thought of what it means to be educated in relation to what it means to be less educated. That has a good and a bad history. I think now we have to think about that. As machines get better at being machines, how do we help humans get better at being human? And in the workplace, in a world that will be radically reshaped by artificial intelligence, the most valuable workers and the most valuable people will be the ones who are the best at being human, not in relation to less educated humans, but in relationship to machines.
So there's a lot to unpack there, and I would like to call on both of you to respond to this question. Mary, in your position as an employer, obviously you saw this impacted by I'm sure you saw it in your workforce over the years that you were at Health Partners and other jobs that you held, how technology is reshaping the workforce, and how the liberal arts can indeed, in this new space that's being created in the workforce, how can you still be a change agent, and how we can promote the liberal arts as a change agent. So how did you see it in the past when you saw basically these technological waves impact your workforce?
Yeah, so I think in every industry, there are huge technology changes that have occurred and will continue to occur. And I really liked Rich's comment about adaptable. You know, I tend to think of it a little bit differently, or use a different set of words. I think of the importance of having lifelong learners, because it is about adaptation, but it's also about people who are continually curious and forward-thinking and looking for opportunities to make tomorrow different than today, and who sort of have that attitude of, we know more today than we did yesterday, so we can do things differently. So the not threatened by change attitude. I also think the importance of people as leaders is really highlighted in a world where technology is doing more of the work for us. So I expect all of you to produce graduates who are ready to step up and lead other people. And I think frequently in healthcare, I hear physicians who have had incredible STEM education backgrounds, who want to move into leadership roles, who want to be able to be more effective in leading teams, talk to me about, should I go back and get an MBA? Is that really the next thing that I need in order to lead people? And my answer is always no, because anybody can learn to read a financial statement, but not everybody can learn how to understand and work with and through others. And I think in an environment where technology is increasingly capable, liberal arts graduates can both understand technology, but also need to understand people and their own capabilities in working with and through others in new ways. I think a lot has happened to make sure that people who complete liberal arts degrees are more capable of working in teams rather than in isolation. That's a positive change that has occurred. But I think that conscious focus on how to lead is a really important one for the future. The other piece that technology will never bring to the table, that only people can bring, is the focus on values. And so I think a liberal arts education that emphasizes both understanding your own values and frankly having some is a really important element of shaping the education for the future.
when you say that, I think about, with all the emphasis and admiration of these, the tech companies and the 5 largest that were referenced by Rich, I do think there's something to that specifically, is that especially when it comes to data ethics, which increasingly is getting more and more attention, and when our privacy is no longer, our private matters are really no longer our own. They know everything about us. You do need to put in a value system, and if not, the companies should know the government will come after them and regulate them. So they need to be ahead of that.
Absolutely, and I think the other part of that is, and Rich made this point about culture, I would make it about values. It's easy to have the words up on the wall, and it's easy to think in sort of black and white terms, yes and no, and harsh judgments. And I'll tell you, it's really hard to make some of those calls. It is not an easy thing to live your values, and sometimes they oppose one another. And so having graduates, having students who understand, this is not simple stuff. This is really complicated, hard stuff that you lose sleep over at night. Incredibly important. I'll just give one personal story. It's my own North Star story for business decision making, and I was pretty new at Health Partners. I was called into a meeting. We had been doing a merger with what is now one of the bigger hospitals in St. Paul, and some of the doctors had decided that maybe Medicare wasn't paying them enough, that they weren't billing adequately. So they brought in some outside consultants to look at their billing practices. And the consultant came back and said, hey, guess what? The problem's not that you were billing too little. The problem's that you've been billing too much. And so I'd walked into the meeting, you could tell it was going to be bad because everybody was quiet. And this fact got out there. Well, the challenge is when Medicare finds out you haven't been billing right, they don't assume you started it yesterday. They assume you started it at least 3 years ago. They don't assume you did it in one department. They assume you've done it everywhere. They don't assume you did it by accident. They assume you did it with fraudulent intent. So by the time we calculated the value of all that, it was $30 million, which was bigger than our bottom line. So you can imagine, stomach twisted, really anxious, quiet room. What are we going to do? And people started saying things like, well, maybe we could find some places we underbilled, or maybe they won't find it, or they just audited us not too long ago. If we fix it now, maybe they won't catch it. And our CEO at the time, my predecessor, said, stop. I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to self-report to Medicare. We're going to call a board meeting for tomorrow, and we're going to hire the smartest damn attorneys we can find to help us negotiate with the government. Stomach untwist. You could sleep at night. I didn't have to wonder what kind of place I worked. And what was important to me about that wasn't that it took all day to make that decision, or we made it a week later or a month later or after a board meeting. It was do the right thing right now. And so for me, that story was important, partly because I had the visceral reaction of my stomach unclenching, but also because it helped me tell that story at Health Partners literally hundreds of times, because with 21, now 24,000 employees, people make thousands of decisions every day that are either aligned with that kind of value or not. And you can never policy make or rule make your way to that kind of decision making. You can only act your way to it. And so that's what I mean by that's not easy. It hurt. $30 million, that hurt. But in that case, it was so clear what the right thing is to do. I wish it was that clear all the time, but when you get it right one time, you got to keep building on it. So that's what I mean about people confronting their own values, understanding what they stand for, and I think a lot of that happens, especially with young adults in the education system.
It's interesting in that one example that you showed, You have leadership, making a fast decision, critical thinking, understanding what the costs would be if you chose another route. Values, that we had to basically step up and admit that mistake, and grit as well, because you need a hard shell when you were making a decision like that. So all of it encapsulated in one decision that you can point to continuously as an example of hopefully what the students would come out with and be able to do themselves. Randy, I want to talk about, or just go back to the whole idea of this new workforce paradigm that people are anticipating with robotics and AI and machine learning taking the place of how many thousands, millions of workers, et cetera. There have been concerns like this throughout recent history, certainly, and humans have always found a way to augment, as you mentioned, this learning. But to some extent, it's also a bit of a crisis because this is an unknown. We really don't know what the capabilities of these technologies are. So every opportunity also every crisis always presents an opportunity as well. So what would you tell the people in this room if you were going to change your narrative to make sure that you are still relevant in this changing dynamic? What are some of the things that they should truly be emphasizing to the people that they are trying to persuade to hire their students, but also to the students who may be coming to you and asking, is this still worthwhile for me to spend 4 years of my life and tens of thousands of dollars?
Well, I think that there's at least two levels to that response. One is what to tell, how to make the case to students and parents. And there, I think it's really about getting our campuses in a way that I don't think any of our schools, and we're going to try to launch a conversation at Georgetown next year to try to ramp up our attention to this, have really thought as deeply as they need to about what our curriculum is doing to prepare people for the next 30 years or 40 years. Our traditionally aged students will be peaking in their careers in like the 2040s. And per a joke that was made earlier, I'm calculating when a career peaks based on whatever age I am. So, but I mean, that's like decades into where people predict our students' lives will be significantly reshaped. And it's not just about working with technology, it's just about their entire lives will be reshaped by artificial intelligence and the social inequality that will arise and increased polarization quite possibly. So I think part of it is to have a narrative that says we're sort of retooling our curriculum for the future, of which we are confident, and I think this meeting has been a great example of it. We are deeply confident that what we've been doing for a couple hundred years is part of what we need to keep doing to prepare students for that future. And everything you were talking about validates that. But I think your really fantastic story about that decision, and you ask, what does it mean to prepare students to make that kind of decision? I think that says to higher education, we're not doing enough. That liberal arts education has to up its game to do what we've been doing and to be doing more, which means we have to do it in different ways because we can't just do more. It has to be somehow integrative and different and creatively rethought. So I think at the student and family level, it's partially to assure that we have our eye on the future. And I don't think that the public discourse about higher ed really thinks that higher ed has its eye on the future because we're so good at having our eye on the past. Then I think there's another level to it, which is also assuring the communities that matter to us. And it might be the community right around our campus, but it might be the communities from which we draw our students. It might be the state. How do we, that part of why we exist is to help them cope with a changing future. And I think possibly the most significant paradigm shift for all of liberal education is to shift from thinking only about individuals to thinking about communities. I think we still are deeply entrenched in a very individualistic model of education. And so I think, and those two things are deeply related because then one can imagine reimagining a curriculum for making those kinds of judgments by educating students and engaging with their communities. So it's easy to bring those two levels together, or I shouldn't say easy. It's easy to conceive of bringing them together.
And it also argues to one of the other points here is that persuades the doubters that liberal arts, again, will create good citizens, because if you engage with the community as a college and you encourage your students to do so as well, they should learn more of the civic values that you have both on an intellectual and a practical basis.
Right, and I think, just if I can grab the mic back for 1 second, I think that in the extent that, backward design begins with what do you want your graduates to be able to know and do and value, and then you backwardly design the curriculum. Like, we spent 100 years really well backwardly designing the curriculum from like the 50-page thesis, right, or something like that. What if you're backwardly designing the curriculum from the capacity of a graduate to make a values-based difficult decision in situ? What does that mean for the capstone, for the fourth year, for the third year, for the second year, for the first year? How do you give people practice in every possible way? How do you redefine what a high-impact practice is based on the ability to make a values-based judgment in conditions of uncertainty?
Can you give us some more concrete examples of what you've done at Georgetown to make sure this goes through the curriculum?
In the next hour.
Sorry. I'm getting ahead of the models of success. That's what you call a tease in journalism. So I want to ask, Mary, I want to just pick up on something that we heard last evening from Adam Weinberg as well, something that a liberal arts education has offered, increasingly tries to push for the participants in the programs, and that's being a global or international experience. And he had some very interesting and creative ways as how you could actually bring that to the students even without sending the students overseas, by going to different immigrant communities, for example, that might be close to the schools, and immersing the student in there for a couple of days, etc. When you, as an employee, how important is that international, the global perspective when you are looking to hire someone?
That's an interesting question, I think an important question, because in the situation at Health Partners, our community is diverse, and we want our workforce to be very well connected to the community that we serve and look like the community that we serve. So diversity in all its forms, and particularly in Minneapolis and St. Paul with so many new Americans and immigrants, it's an important aspect of being able to connect with the people who are our customers. And I guess I would say this. One of the things that I really learned through the Itasca project work, we did a project with Brookings Institution, and they looked at why the economy in our city was doing pretty well. And the answer that came back is, well, it's not our natural resources, and it's not, being a technology hub, but it was having a highly educated workforce. And so literally the single most important factor for the economic vitality of our community was having people who are educated. And we know that in a changing community, the risk of people being left behind is really accompanied or really caused by lack of education. And so this work, not all of it, of course, through liberal arts institutions, but making sure that we have pathways open for shared education that goes beyond high school is incredibly important, not only to the individual's success and future financial well-being, but it's for the success of all of us in a community relies on education. And I think having urgency about that is really important. And so one of the more recent initiatives in the community is a group that I'm serving as the first board chair. I'm very proud of this work. It's called the Center for Economic Inclusion, because that's really the risk that we face, is whole segments of our community who are not included in economic success because jobs aren't available, education isn't available, and we need that to change if we want to have a bright future. So I think hugely important that connection not only to individuals, but to communities as well.
Yeah, just to reinforce, I think this expanding our sense of boundaries to creating a shared sense of urgency and a shared sense of connection feels like the bigger set of what Adam was really wonderfully talking about last night, that it was about global, but it was also about intercultural understanding, intergroup dialogue, the capacity for empathy, the capacity to be a listener, the capacity to understand that your worldview is just not your own worldview. And I think that expecting to educate our students to have a larger horizon than themselves is the most important thing. But the parallel to that is what you just said, is that our colleges have to develop a larger horizon than just themselves. We need to expect of ourselves what we're actually expecting of our students.
So if we are going to change the narrative, I tend to think of what I hear from some of the customers or clients, I guess you could say, we have in the current job. We serve executives of different levels, et cetera, and they all talk about what you have both mentioned, the need for creating a diverse, inclusive workforce, for gathering workers who have critical thinking skills, writing skills being important. While they say we need data scientists, we need, some of the STEM jobs, I should say. Yeah, exactly. That whatever that cognitive decline, sometimes I think I'm at that age. But they certainly need the employees with those skills as well, but increasingly they say it's changing. And I tend to think of, I keep a running list in my mind of business leaders who have talked about the importance of a liberal arts education. Lloyd Blankfein, who's the CEO of Goldman Sachs, David Rubenstein of the private equity world, Mark Cuban, and then recently I was speaking with Andy Bryant, who's the CEO, or the chairman, the former CEO of Intel, and he was saying, 10 years from now or 5 years from now, the next person who leads Intel and a number of these major technology companies that we were talking about will not be an engineer, it will be a generalist because of the evolution of the workforce, of the work itself, of the companies itself as well. So I lay that groundwork in large part because when you're trying to change a narrative, when you're trying to get your message out, you need to choose amplifiers in the community to help you with that message. And I'm struck that while you have some people in high profile positions, there do not seem to be a core group of amplifiers who can talk consistently about the benefits of a liberal arts education. So do you have a suggestion as how this could happen? Because it's a big ask. And do you start small with your community, as you were talking about? This is what we do within the community. These are the benefits that this college brings, this university brings. And then eventually do you hope for a ripple effect? But how do you layer that messaging?
Gosh, well, I think what you're really talking about is a form of social change, and it seems as though most social change happens both from the perspective of influencers who are key champions and influencers. And while I think CEOs are decent at that, that's a very incomplete list. So, who are the political leaders? Who are the other community leaders who are able to bring their voice to the importance of a broader and more liberal education? And then on sort of the grass tops end of things, how can graduates of liberal arts programs do a better job of connecting with students who are considering their futures and help them see the paths and the doorways that can open because you have that set of skills and capabilities. And I think that more sort of grassroots beginning could be an important part of changing the narrative for the future. And I do think, frankly, I'm not a very big fan of any politicians right now, but I can see the important role that that leaders articulating why in a democratic society an educated population is essential. people who can discern good ideas from bad ideas, people who can think critically, people who can articulate a different point of view and write it and speak it. And I think there's some value there too.
I like that. We could work that both ways. So the politicians that are good politicians with liberal arts educations, we can say, see what a liberal arts education does? And the ones without liberal arts educations that we don't like, we can say, see? If they'd had a liberal arts education. I think the other amplifier that we don't make enough use of is alumni. I mean, I think we do on our websites, and I think we do internally, but I'm not sure that we have as much data as we should. I think really the Gallup Purdue stuff that Brandon and his folks have been working on is really the first long-term data we have on alumni outcomes really in the United States. And I think that can be one of the most powerful kinds of pieces of data. If we really believe that we're about the seventh job, not the first job, we're really about creating leaders, not just first-level employees, then we should be able to talk about that with as much exactitude as we can talk about the composition of our first-year class.
I have another question, and part of it comes from an observation, and then we'll wrap up because unfortunately we're running out of time. But I also think there is a headwind, at least in this country, of anti-intellectualism, which is associated with a liberal arts education. So you can talk to a certain segment of the population who's actually interested in hearing about it, but what about the segment of the population who isn't interested in hearing about it? And how do you change their mind and convince them that this is important to society, it's important to their children's futures? It could be important to their future if they're a late bloomer.
Yeah, I mean, I really think the case to be made is education is power. And people don't think that way. I mean, education is power in creating your own future. It's power financially. It's power in the community. And I think people are interested in the extent to which they can shape their own lives. But I don't think we make that case very often. And I do worry that too many of our heroes, athletes, actors, entertainers, have no higher education at all. So normally when you were talking about, who can be the champions, I was thinking, oh yeah, well then you would normally turn to, well, that's not a value. And yet those are people who are put forward as heroes for young folks. So we've got to figure out who else can be the heroes.
Well, there's also some pretty good research that shows that while the public distrusts higher education, especially elite higher education, and with this anti-intellectual bias, that people actually feel pretty good about the schools that are in their communities. That most people say, yeah, I'm very anti-elite higher education, but I love blah, blah, blah state university and wouldn't miss a game, or go to a clinic that's run by them, et cetera. So I do think that there's a difference between a broad anti-intellectualism and a sense of people's connection to their local places. The other thing I was just going to share, something that we've started to think a lot about at Georgetown along the lines of things I've been discussing, is asking what kinds of educational, what we've been calling educational capital, can we bring out to the communities around us? And I don't mean that in the dollars and cents at all. I mean that's one thing that actually every college and university has, is a sense of educational opportunity and what different kinds of choices can lead to. Working with communities as early as when their kids are in middle school is really the time to help share that educational capital equitably in a way that it's held by middle and upper middle class people sort of naturally. And I think that that's just a real easy way for universities to connect to communities with knowledge that they actually own.
The other thing that would be interesting to think about is, in any other kind of campaign to change a narrative, you literally do go and do the research. What are the words? What are the stories? What are the ways to reframe old conversations, engaging key constituencies in new ways? And I'm not sure higher education's actually done that. But it's something we, as in any big organization, would absolutely use that kind of discipline to change the narrative.
And we'll let that be the final word. Mary and Randy, I want to thank you very much. And now Randy, who has graciously agreed to do double duty this morning, is going to present his models for success.
If people want to stand up for a minute. That was a rhetorical question. Okay. You're almost there. So let's go ahead and take seats. So the prehistory of this is probably not clear to you, but the other person on the panel was going to be Mike McPherson, who was one of the co-authors of Lesson Plan and former president of the Spencer Foundation and Macalester College, and just a wonderful person, and who had to cancel for personal reasons at the last minute. So that's why I became that person, and I was always supposed to be this person. So I apologize for you getting sort of a double dose of me. This is mostly a working session, but I want to take like 15 minutes at the front end to do a little bit of setup, just as per has been the design here. I'll build on the few slides that I showed at the beginning of the panel, and then set you guys to work. So to go back to start with my right quadrant, my upper right quadrant, the first quadrant of inclusive and integrative, and integrative, meaning all the things that we mean, and I'll talk more about it. But we're working in that quadrant. So let me just say a few things about that, and then I want to give you a couple of examples from Georgetown, the work I'm doing there. So one question is, so what is it that matters in this quadrant? If we're really trying to build out what it means for us to live and work in this quadrant, is it just doing a little bit more of this and that, or what is it that matters? So I just have a few things that matter. This is all stuff that you guys believe and have been talking about for 2 days, so I'm perfectly capable of droning on about, but I'm going to try to just rifle through them. So one thing that matters is, at base, active learning. And I use the term at base because, I still go speak at places where they're having active learning workshops for faculty and things like that. But I think in many ways, if you look at the research, it now shows that we actually know that active learning is the floor. Active learning is a kind of minimal professional practice. Many of you may know the Freeman et al. Article came out in PNAS a couple of years ago. They did this massive meta-study of active learning studies in which they show that active learning improves performance and retention in STEM fields. And toward the end of that article, they say, if this had been a healthcare study, that this study might have been stopped for cause, right? Stopped for benefit, because it was clear that, clear that the intervention was so superior to the control, right? So implying, to me, what that implies is that schools not supporting active learning are, we're at a point where we can consider that kind of minimal professional practice, and not supporting it kind of educational malpractice. But that's the floor, so that matters in this quadrant. Teaching to the whole person matters, and the things like empathy, curiosity. I love the emphasis on curiosity, things that have come up today. I love Mary. I usually have a joke about how I call things like curiosity, creativity, ethical judgment, humility, resilience, grit. I call those hard skills, so I'm glad she made the point about soft skills. Soft skills to me are things like economics, chemistry, econometrics, stuff you can learn in classes. But anyway, we know that educating the whole person matters, and in a world driven increasingly by artificial intelligence, those whole person things matter even more. And Brandon told us yesterday that, and people know intuitively, that relationships matter, but we now have data that we know deeply that relationships matter to people's sense of flourishing. And we know that deep engagement matters, so all the talk about high impact practices and what it means to really engage or to be in a position to make, to practice making hard judgments. The Carnegie Foundation did 10 years of studies of a whole range of professions many years ago under Lee Schulman's. And the one thing they found was common to the development of all professionals and all practitioners was what they called judgment in uncertainty. That the most important thing you want in a practitioner of anything is the capacity to know what to do when it isn't obvious to know what to do. That's perhaps the most human of executing things, and that's what the leader of the company said at that $30 million, that was a judgment in conditions of uncertainty. That comes from deep engagement, high impact practices, unscripted situations that are mentored and guided. And we also know that whether students think what they're doing matters. Right? And I'm going to tell a story about that in a few minutes. So these things all matter. Active learning, whole personality, relationships, deep engagement, doing work that matters. We could add to that list getting outside yourself, having a horizon larger than yourself, understanding that your perspective is limited and possibly manipulated by your digital environment, et cetera. And all that has to do, I think now, not just about making people better people, but making people better at being human. So to me, that vector is about all kinds of things related to high impact project-based learning, engaged learning, et cetera. It doesn't mean people don't sit around tables and read old texts. That's part of that, but that's the center line of our narrative. So the bio that's in the book is actually an old bio, which I think I finally successfully found on the internet where that was coming from, and I have eradicated it. So I'm actually now not associate professor and associate provost. I'm actually professor and vice provost for education at Georgetown. But one of the main things I do is I lead something called the Designing the Futures Initiative at Georgetown, which we started 4 years ago for the purpose of trying to accelerate change at Georgetown. We've done a series of things. I've been the founding director of the Innovation Center, et cetera. And we operate out of this little red townhouse right off campus. So sometimes it's called the Red House. And basically what we're trying to do, I try never to use the word disruption on my campus. Learned that the hard way, but thank you very much, liberal arts education. But then what we're trying to do is generate variations on our model. We're just trying to put more things on the table. If you've ever read Stephen Johnson's Where Good Ideas Come From, he says it doesn't come from sitting around thinking big thoughts, it's putting more tools on the table to play with. So that's what we're trying to do. And I think of it as that there's 3 things you need for that. You need top-down permission, president, provost, board. Then you need grassroots creativity. But then what I'm running out of the Red House is what I think of as an R&D mechanism that has the authority to clear obstacles. And I think that's a really critical piece. I meet lots of my counterparts around the country who are blessed by the president, but they run greenhouses on the margins of the institution. And it makes a big difference that I'm vice provost and I can bring the registrar, the advising deans, the accreditation people, financial aid people together and say, here's a wacky idea. How do we make this work? We say out of the Red House that the #1 rule for every project we support is that it has to break at least 1 rule. Right? It has to break at least 1 rule. So if, and I don't mean this in, anyway, if all you want to do is improve your pedagogy, then you should go to the Center for Teaching. They do great work. What we do is we help people create new things that mess with the model. the standard 15-week, 3-credit course, what we mean by a course, how we assign credit, how we accrue credits, how we count minors, how we count faculty load. Every project we support is a pilot, Doretta, it's all about pilots. It's all about what I think of as small but game-changing pilots. So they're not just pilots, they're pilots that are just nudging our model. Because my theory of the future, even though why it's called Designing the Futures, is that we have no idea what we should be in 20 years, per se. But what we need is to do everything we can faster than we would have done it naturally to put ourselves in a position to be in the best possible position to adapt. Picking up on Rich. So 2, I hope, quick stories, and then I'm going to put you to work, but just give you a couple concrete things that have grown out of this work. So the first is something called Core Pathways, which was a pilot that we're running with our core curriculum, Jesuit Catholic school, as you know, core curriculum, 2 theology, 2 philosophy, blah, blah, blah. But this was trying to give students a novel way of navigating through the core. Some of you may have projects like this on your own campus, in which we tried to array core courses around big themes. And the first one we chose was climate change. And so we just ran our first full pilot all last year and are ramping up for next year. And it's an interdisciplinary way for students to engage the problem of climate change from as many fields as possible through the core. Students can spend up to 2 years in a single pathway or a pathway. I'll try to explain the model here. So that's an example of all these different fields contribute to it. We have the theology of climate change, ethics of climate change, climate justice, history, environmental history, humanities. We have a strong environmental humanities group. One of our courses genres are the Anthropocene science. We have every science, chemistry, biology, physics. Have our first community-based module next fall, urban ecology, being offered in the pathway. But the critical thing about this was that we wanted students to experience moving from discipline to discipline fairly quickly. So we wanted to try something shorter than a full semester. So we invented 7-week, 1.5 credit modules. Had never existed before. So we just made that up. So students take a module on theology, then science, then go back to theology or go on to history, etc. When you've taken 2 1.5 credit modules in a core requirement, you can count it as one of your core requirements. When faculty have taught 2 1.5 credit modules, it adds up to a 3-credit course. But you don't have to do that continuously. In fact, there's a rule that students can't take the same discipline 2 modules in a row. They have to switch modules. The key to this is that all the modules are offered in the same time slot. Greatest professional achievement of my career. Going on my tombstone. Yeah, almost last October, but the key then, and I want to do this quickly, and I'm happy to answer questions about it, is that so faculty teach their discipline, but then there's this integrative apparatus that wraps around it. Everybody gets together. All the students from the modules are in one room for opening night. I'll take a science tutorial, how scientists know there's climate change. Week 4, they're all in one room in that time slot doing a big moral imagination exercise led by our Kennedy Institute of Ethics. That's what it looks like when they're mostly very small classes, but that's what it looks like when everybody's in one room, just one day. Week 13, big role-playing policy simulation, imaginary island, everybody has a different role, rising sea levels. Then a final interdisciplinary exercise, everybody together, and then in the spring, lather, rinse, repeat, as we say. 2 important points about this. 1, this did not come out of 3 years of conversation about how we should change the general education program. I've had that. All my life I've been part of that. I chair the core curriculum committee. This is a pilot. We made this up. We got the core curriculum committee, which I co-chair, to endorse it, and then just said, let's just try it. Maybe it'll last, maybe it won't. But the point was not necessarily to invent a new core curriculum. Didn't even talk about the core requirements. I knew not to do that. but just to put more pieces on the table, to open people's imagination up of what it could look like to engage the core. You know, and it models interdisciplinarity for students, gives them a different way to experience their core requirement, connects what had been disconnected core, how do I get rid of my theology requirement? But it also deeply plays into faculty self-interest, and I think self-interest is a highly undervalued element in curriculum transformation, right? Lets disciplinary faculty just be them. The integrative apparatus wraps around it, fixed structure and load. It actually engages small departments into the core in ways that they hadn't been, and it gives faculty flexibility in their own rhythms. Anyway, happy to answer questions about that. But that's an example. For 2 years, we had little tiny experiments where we had individual courses playing with 1-credit modules, bundling 1-credit modules. By the time we introduced this, like nobody was doing that 4 years ago. By the time we introduced this, people were like, oh yeah, bundling, yeah, we do that. Like modules, right, those are all over now. But we could never have introduced this 4 years ago without the little steps of pushing the model. Second example, then I'll stop. This is a story of, I'm sure many of you have similar programs. It's a bridge program for trying to increase our first-gen low-income students. In particular, we had a problem of losing students out of the sciences. So we didn't lose them out of Georgetown, but we lost them out of the sciences. Consequently, we stopped enrolling them in the sciences. So this was a project called Regent Science Scholars. There's a summer bridge program, which I'll tell you a quick story about. But it also, which I'll just mention again in a minute, also has a very critical digital component where students over summers and winter breaks take these non-credit knowledge building modules to prepare them for the next set of courses. In 3 years, we increased the number of low-income first-gen students in the biomedical sciences by 5 times. And more than 20% of last year's matriculating class are first-gen low-income students. That was 2% 4 years ago. This quick story, ironically and coincidentally, takes place at a winery. It's called the Glen Manor Farrow Wine Project. I don't know if Glen Manor has a night watchman, but but I'm interested in applying because the fact that this story takes place at my wife and my favorite winery is not a coincidence. So that's out in Virginia. The guy's the winemaker. The professor is in the foreground, also happens to be my wife. She would say if she talked about this, they redid the entire summer bridge program to focus on basically mapping the microbiome of this guy's winery. It emerged out of, we went out for barrel tasting. He was complaining that he, unlike big wineries, doesn't have anybody to test his soils. He knows some things, not other things. She said, has anybody ever mapped your microbiome? Which seemed like a kind of personal question, but I was enjoying the wines. She's thinking I could build a whole curriculum about this. So she decides to basically set the entire summer bridge group who's coming in, remember, 5 weeks before matriculating at Georgetown, low-income first-gen students on this problem. So what she would say, if I had time to show the clip, is that we covered everything we were going to cover in this bridge biology chemistry course. It was just done in the service of this project. So you don't sacrifice content to shift to project-based if you do it right. The second thing was how daunted the students were at first, but how within 2 days it became, how can this help Jeff? Jeff White is the winemaker. And I was just talking to her on the phone last night. Yesterday was day 2 of this year's version. She said, sure enough, she had 5 students stop by her office with ideas for the design of the experiment, and every one of them said, will this help Jeff? Right? In 2 days. And the key thing is these are students who are here for a summer bridge program who all think they're frauds, who all think they're imposters, who all think they don't belong. And in 2 days, it's what will help Jeff. Here's an email from one of the students from last year. Been thinking about the design of the lab all night. Think I have an understanding now after reading the material all over again. My suggestion is to create an experiment with 20 control groups. Greatest sentence ever. Blah, blah, blah. Does this seem possible? Can this lead me to understanding its flavor profile, giving Jeff the best possible taste? Of course, it's ironic. These are all 17 and 18-year-olds, of course. they were reading these technical articles about viticulture and these screenings, gram staining and stuff, and they said, write any terms on the board you don't understand. First term that went up was Merlot. But who can actually understand that anyway, right? We're all puzzled by Merlot. So. Anyway, that's an aerial view of the vineyards, beautiful up on a hill. That's his soil maps. That's the student's design. They spent a week arguing about it, a week studying it, and ended up, high, low, everything. What they were going to do, all those numbers, which rows, which elevations, which soils, all their design after a week of developing it. And then we went out, took soil samples based on their specs, brought it back. The students worked on it for 4 weeks. Right? Then we took them out to the vineyard. Lower left, that's people walking up and down the rows looking for their dirt. The dirt that they own. That's their dirt. It's like row 12, like people yelling, row 12. I've been working on row 12 for 4 weeks. That's my dirt. These guys are taking selfies of themselves in front of their dirt. Then down onto the crush pad of the winery, where in 7 different teams, the students presented their findings. Those are powerful pictures. That's the winemaker turning to those students and saying, what's next? Right? Haven't even matriculated into Georgetown. The other thing, just a point to make about this is not only is it course-embedded undergraduate research, experiential learning, we've also built in this high-tech piece that is necessary to keeping the students in the game. So before every term, they take non-credit modules, preparing them for the coursework that they're signed up for. So if they're going into physics, they're going into genetics, et cetera. All non-credit, all focused around big threshold concepts in those fields. We don't have to charge them tuition. They don't get credit for it. We didn't have to get faculty departmental approval for these modules. We just built them. Proven to be incredibly helpful. High tech, high touch. One little version of human-machine complementarity. Both necessary to work in that quadrant. So those are the things that matter in this quadrant. I think everybody in this room came to this conference believing that those things mattered. But how do we think about them in light of sort of the biggest threats facing our society? Social inequality, polarization, climate change, artificial intelligence. Do we start to look at those values differently and with a greater sense of urgency and with a greater holistic sense of the curriculum if we're thinking about the next 30 or 40 years, not the last 30 or 40 years? And what would it look like to work with our campuses to move toward that? So, in that spirit, it's time to ask you to get to work. I have 3 questions. I don't even know what time it is. We have till 11:30? Okay. So we'll take about 10 minutes for each of these questions. And the first one is, what could you do more to focus your campus community on the future and the kind of broader context we've been talking about, really the whole conference, but especially this morning? And would that be helpful to get them to focus more broadly or on the future? So take some time to talk at your tables about that. Oh, wait, sorry. That was like a hugely cognitive, horrible thing to do, and I apologize. Now I've done that, which made it even worse. I'm happy to later or now, if anybody, maybe I'll just get you to work on that, but I'm happy to take a few minutes to answer questions about any of the example. I was going to pause to just give you a kind of brain cleanser to do questions, but I'm happy to leave a few minutes at the end for questions about the models if there are any. So, but why don't we just go ahead and get to work on those? As you were. Sure. So I should have asked. Take another minute or two on this, and then we'll shift. Okay. I'm going to interrupt you. Put up the next question, and then you can go back to talking about whatever you were talking about. I have no illusions what's going on here, but I have a job to do. So the second question is this. One of the things that I learned teaching with this wonderful architect and designer, Ann Pendleton-Julian, all those years, but that I think about all the time in my work out of the Red House, is that we're not trying to solve problems per se, we're trying to design for tensions, which I think it's a very interesting distinction. So here's the next question. Design always begins with the tensions. You're always designing for the tensions. You're always designing for the tensions, and not necessarily to eradicate them at all. Sometimes to inhabit them, just to inhabit them better or differently. Much different place to begin. So what are three, you can pick as many as you want. I've been in contexts where the tensions just flow out. What are three, at least, of the most salient tensions facing your campus as you think about the future? And don't just think like having money, having no money. Like, try to get a little bit deeper than that. So if you want to talk about that, talk about that. If you want to go back to whatever you're talking about before, do that. So take 10 more minutes on this one, 5-10 minutes.
Randy, I just want to say this has been exceptional. Exceptional. So exceptional. So super exceptional. And whatever other superlatives you want to put in front of that. So thank you very, very much. And thanks for doing double duty.
Well, when I also was Integrative, other than freedom, of course, is where I finished. This is kind of
Yeah, and you got it. I don't know if you can hear the gasp expressions as your questions pop up. I hope maybe one day my team and I can come to the red out all the time. We're to see your work. So I just wanted to say thank you.
Okay, just to let you know, I'm putting up a third question, which very much builds on this. So, and it's simply this: how could you create a more agile design environment for institutional change that could address the tensions you've been identifying? Back to work. Okay. Shall we take just a couple of minutes to wrap up? And if there's any questions, and then Mary is going to say a couple words to conclude. So I'm interested if we just want to debrief, a couple of ideas that have come to people in this session that feels like it pushed your thinking at all, or pulled together your thinking. Are there ideas that came up at your table that you're going to go back and try around creating a more agile environment or around particular tensions? I'm also interested in hearing what tensions you focused on. But any tables would like to volunteer to say something? There you go. There's an enthusiastic hand.
Don't worry, I got some. Okay, Carlene, admission, St. Vincent John's. One major tension is tradition and traditionalism. I was taught that in community organizing. So tradition, kind of the living ideas of those who've gone before, that can evolve. Traditionalism, dead ideas of dead people that have no relevance anymore. And I think if we can better define the outlines of that and determine and discern what is traditionalism that doesn't serve our mission and what is tradition that can evolve for the future, we can let go of what's no longer serving us and focus our energies on what does.
Great. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I mean, if the agile innovation is really couched in just saying this begins with who we are and who we always want to be. It's just new ways to be who we have always been, and some version of that. Yeah. I think that's really critical. I think of that sometimes as that we're just trying to figure out which are the load-bearing walls and how every other wall can be remodeled. Other thoughts about attention or a practice that you're going to try?
Hi, everyone. I'm Hannah Salto from the College of St. Benedict. I'm the College Navigator Fellow here. So I have a little naivete in higher ed. I'm 23, so I'm not well versed in everything. But something we talked about tensions is kind of the idea of silos and being unconnected from different departments and people on campus. And everyone being so busy all the time that we don't take time to come back and revisit, topics like this and these big ideas and how to implement stuff like that. So something that I think is really interesting is the idea that some other institutions have of common time during the week. So, taking an hour out of the day where people get together and talk about things and not necessarily like having meetings like we do over lunch when we skip our lunch or whatever throughout the day, but having common time. And I'm not at the level to create something like that. So whoever, Mary, I think that could be a really important step for our institutions, is to take that time to meet with people.
And also just let people feel like they're heard on these topics. When we started designing the futures, we got a faculty committee together and asked them if we were going to do this kind of visioning thing, what would they want? And the two things they said was, we want to respond to something, we don't want to start from scratch, and we don't want to just talk. So it could be that common time can be a place for conversation, but people can feel good that maybe that conversation is potentially leading to something. So some balance of those two things. But yeah, people not feeling railroaded by innovation. Innovation can be a word that feels like we're going to move really fast and make your life worse. So, I think your point about common time is really critical to get people to feel really comfortable with thinking about these big questions. The last comment? Anybody have more? Yeah, there we go. There's a mic sneaking up behind you.
Thank you. Susan Larson at Concordia College, and we have a number of professional programs, and so a tension that we have that is really quite productive for us and isn't one that we would want to disappear, but we always pay attention to, is between the professional programs and the liberal arts and how we work together and how we move forward together. And so that's kind of an ongoing tension, but usually to the good, but one that we always need to pay attention to.
Yeah, great, thank you. Well, I'm going to turn it back over to Mary. Is there any other questions or comments that anybody would like to make? Hey, thank you for being so engaged in this session.
Thank you. Well, I just wanted to actually thank you, Randy, for your time today and inspiration and good thoughts. And I hope everyone have a few ideas to take back to their colleges to work with.